The fall of the manila envelope landed on Meredith Cross's desk with a soft thud that somehow felt louder than thunder. She didn't need to open it to know what it contained. The security guard's apologetic expression and the hurried way her colleagues avoided eye contact told the whole story. "Ms. Cross, I'm sorry, but you need to pack your things immediately," the guard murmured, his weathered face creased with genuine sympathy. "Mr. Thorne's orders?" Meredith's fingers trembled as she reached for the envelope. Inside, a single sheet of company letterhead bore the corporate seal of Thorne Industries and exactly 3 lines of text, effective immediately. "Your employment is terminated for insubordination and breach of company policy. Security will escort you out. Do not return to company premises." No signature, no explanation beyond those cold, clinical words. Just the digital stamp that everyone in the building knew belonged to Sebastian Thorne himself. The irony wasn't lost. On her 24 hours ago, she'd been the company's rising star, the environmental consultant who'd helped Thorne Industries secure 3 major green energy contracts worth millions. Her presentations were polished, her reports meticulous, and her dedication to both profit and environmental responsibility had earned her respect from colleagues, across departments. But yesterday, everything changed when she discovered the files hidden deep in the company's servers. Waste disposal records that didn't match the public reports. Chemical analyses showing contamination levels far exceeding legal limits. GPS coordinates pointing to dumping sites dangerously close to residential areas and schools. She'd done what any ethical person would do. She'd taken the evidence directly to Sebastian Thorne's office, expecting him to be as horrified as she was by what rogue employees had done in his company's name. Instead, his steel-gray eyes had remained utterly cold as she'd spread the documents across his mahogany desk. He'd listened in silence, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, his expression unreadable as marble. When she'd finished explaining the potential health risks to local communities, he'd simply nodded once and told her he'd handle it personally. She should have known better than to trust a man whose fortune was built on cutting corners and silencing whistleblowers. Now, as Meredith mechanically packed her few personal belongings into a cardboard box, she felt the weight of her colleagues' stares. Some looked sympathetic, others relieved it wasn't them. A few seemed almost satisfied, as if her downfall somehow elevated their own positions in the corporate hierarchy. "This is ridiculous," whispered Janet, her cubicle neighbor, as she helped Meredith gather her botanical sketches from the wall. "Everyone knows you're the most principled person here. What you found in those files don't." Meredith cut her off softly. "Don't make this harder for yourself. Just ... Forget what I told you, okay?" Janet's face fell, but she nodded reluctantly. They both knew how these things worked. Sebastian Thorne didn't just fire people, he destroyed careers. One word from him could blacklist someone from every major firm in the industry. The elevator ride to the lobby felt eternal. Security cameras tracked her every movement. And Meredith found herself wondering if this was how criminals felt during a perp walk. The security guard, whose name tag read Frank, cleared his throat awkwardly. "For what it's worth, miss, I've been doing this job for 15 years, he said quietly. "I can usually tell when someone deserves what's happening to them. This ain't one of those times." Meredith managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Frank. That ... that actually helps." The November air bit through her thin cardigan as she stepped onto the sidewalk. Cardboard box clutched against her chest like a shield. Behind her, the gleaming glass tower of Thorne Industries reached toward the gray sky, its facade reflecting nothing but cold emptiness. Her phone buzzed with a text from her landlord about next month's rent, and another from her student loan servicer. The reality of unemployment hit her like ice water, but underneath the fear, something else burned quietly in her chest. Sebastian Thorne thought he could bury the truth along with her career. It was wrong. The discovery 3 months had passed since Meredith's world had crumbled, and she'd found an unexpected sanctuary in the most unlikely place. Mrs. Chun's garden. A tiny flower shop wedged between a laundromat and a used bookstore had become her refuge from the corporate battlefield that had left her scarred and unemployed. The elderly owner, Grace Chen, had hired her without questions when Meredith had stumbled into the shop one particularly dark afternoon. Desperate for any work that didn't require references from her previous life, Grace had taken one look at Meredith's haunted expression and simply handed her an apron, saying sometimes flowers heal what people break. The pay was a fraction of her former salary, barely enough to cover her studio apartment in the city's forgotten corner. But there was something profoundly peaceful about working with living things instead of corporate spreadsheets. Her hands, once soft from office work, had grown strong from handling soil and stems. Her mind, previously consumed with profit margins and environmental impact assessments, now found solace in the simple rhythm of arranging bouquets and tending 2 delicate orchids. Tonight, the November storm was particularly vicious. Rain hammered against the shop's windows with such ferocity that Meredith had stayed late. Worried about the more fragile plants near the glass, Grace had gone home hours earlier, trusting her completely with the evening routine. As she was securing the last of the outdoor displays, bringing in the hardier potted plants that usually weathered mild weather, a flash of lightning illuminated the street with stark white clarity. That's when she saw him. Across the narrow street, hunched on a bench outside Mercy General Hospital, was a figure that made her heart stop. Even through the sheets of rain, even with his expensive coat soaked through and his perfectly styled hair plastered to his skull, she recognized the rigid set of those shoulders. Sebastian Thorne. But this wasn't the man who had destroyed her career with 3 lines of corporate speak. This version of him was broken, folded in on himself like a discarded newspaper. His hands covered his face, and his entire body shook, whether from cold or something deeper she couldn't tell from. This distance, every rational instinct screamed at her to go back inside, to pretend she hadn't seen him. This was the man who had blacklisted her from her chosen profession, who had chosen profit over people's lives, who had probably forgotten her name the moment security had escorted her from his building. But something else, something that Grace's gentle wisdom had been nurturing in her over these months, whispered differently. This wasn't about Sebastian Thorne, the billionaire CEO. This was about a human being sitting alone in a storm, looking more lost than she had ever felt, even on her worst days. Lightning cracked overhead again. And in that brief illumination, she saw him more clearly. His lips were moving, but she couldn't hear the words over the thunder. His designer shoes were completely soaked, and he seemed oblivious to the fact that he was sitting in a puddle that had formed around the bench. Before she could second-guess herself, Meredith grabbed Grace's old umbrella from behind the counter and stepped into the storm. The rain was shockingly cold, immediately soaking through her cardigan despite the umbrella's protection. Each step toward him felt like walking through quicksand, weighted down by months of anger and hurt. But as she got closer, she began to hear what he was saying. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please don't leave me. Please don't." The words were barely audible, mixed with something that sounded suspiciously like sobbing. She stopped about 5 feet away, unsure how to announce her presence. Up close, Sebastian Thorne looked nothing like the polished predator who had sat behind his mahogany desk, dismissing her concerns. His expensive suit was wrinkled and water-stained. His face, when she caught glimpses of it between his fingers, was red and swollen. "Excuse me," she said softly, having to raise her voice over the storm. "Are you... ... Do you need help?" He looked up then, and the raw anguish in his eyes nearly knocked her backward. These weren't the cold, calculating gray eyes she remembered. These were the eyes of someone whose entire world had just collapsed. "She's dying," he whispered, so quietly that Meredith had to step closer to hear him. "My sister... Emma. She's dying, and it's my fault." The words hit Meredith like physical blows. Sister, dying, his fault. "The doctor said it's environmental poisoning," Sebastian continued, seemingly unaware of who he was talking to, speaking. "To the storm, as much as to her. Chemical exposure over years. They traced it back to the groundwater near her school. ... Near where she grew up." Meredith's breath caught in her throat. The dumping sites, the contaminated areas she'd tried to warn him about. One of them must have been near a school. "They gave her 6 months," he continued, his voice breaking completely now. 6 months because I was too greedy, too arrogant to listen when someone tried to tell me what my company was doing. Too proud to admit that I'd built my empire on poison. Thunder crashed overhead, but Meredith barely heard it. The man she'd painted as a heartless villain in her mind was dissolving before her eyes, revealing someone drowning in guilt that mirrored her own past pain, without fully realizing what she was doing. She stepped closer and held the umbrella over both of them. Sebastian looked up at her then, really looked. But the combination of darkness, rain, and his emotional state seemed to prevent recognition. "Thank you," he whispered. "You don't have to stay, I couldn't go back to my empty apartment. Couldn't face the silence." Meredith found herself settling onto the other end of the bench, maintaining careful distance but sharing the inadequate shelter of the umbrella. She didn't speak. Couldn't speak, really. Her mind was reeling with the implications of what she'd just learned. They sat there in the storm. Two people who had destroyed each other's lives without ever really seeing the human being on the other side of their conflict. For the first time in months, Meredith felt something other than anger or hurt. She felt the terrible, complicated ache of understanding. The reckoning the weeks following that storm-soaked encounter became a strange dance of observation and avoidance. Meredith found herself drawn to the hospital area during her lunch breaks, always carrying flowers for deliveries that didn't exist. Watching from careful distances as Sebastian Thorne transformed before her eyes. Gone were the crisp suits and commanding presence she remembered. This version of him moved through the world like a ghost, arriving at the hospital each morning at exactly 8:30, leaving after visiting hours ended at 9. He'd lost weight, his expensive clothes hanging loose on a frame that seemed to be shrinking with guilt. Dr. Patricia Vance, the oncologist Meredith had befriended during her flower deliveries to the pediatric ward, had unknowingly become her source of information about Emma's condition. That young woman in 314? Dr. Vance had mentioned one afternoon as Meredith arranged fresh lilies in the nurse's station. Such a bright spirit, despite everything. Her brother visits religiously you'd think he was trying to will her better through sheer determination. Meredith's hands had stilled on the flower stems. What's wrong with her? Environmental toxicity. Nasty case, years of exposure to industrial chemicals that got into the groundwater near her old school. The family's been fighting it for months. But Dr. Vance had shaken her head sadly. Sometimes the damage goes too deep. What Dr. Vance didn't know, what nobody except Meredith knew, was that Sebastian had begun a quiet crusade of his own. Through careful research and overheard conversations in hospital corridors, she'd learned about the sudden policy changes at Thorne Industries. Environmental consultants were being hired by the dozens. Cleanup crews were mysteriously appearing at contaminated sites across the city. Anonymous donations were flooding environmental justice organizations. The man who had fired her for exposing his company's crimes was now spending millions, trying to undo the damage too late for his sister, but perhaps not too late for others. One evening, as autumn gave way to early winter, Meredith was closing the flower shop when she spotted Sebastian across the street again. But this time, he wasn't at the hospital. He was standing in front of Murphy's bar, a dive that looked nothing like the sort of place a billionaire would frequent, through the grimy window. She watched him order drink after drink, his shoulders hunched over the bar like a man trying to disappear into the wood grain. The other patrons gave him a wide berth. His grief was palpable even from a distance, creating an invisible barrier around him. She should have walked away. Should have gone home to her small apartment and her simple dinner and pretended she hadn't seen him destroying himself one shot at a time. Instead, she found herself pushing through the bar's heavy door, the scent of stale beer and cigarettes hitting her like a wall. Sebastian didn't look up when she slid onto the stool beside him. His eyes were fixed on his reflection in the mirror behind the bar, but Meredith doubted he was really seeing anything. Whiskey, she told the bartender, a grizzled man who looked like he'd seen every kind of human misery. Whatever he's having, that got Sebastian's attention. He turned slightly, and she saw the exact moment recognition dawned in his bloodshot eyes. His face went white, then red, then settled into an expression of resignation. Meredith Cross, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. I suppose you've come to gloat. No, she replied, accepting her drink with steady hands. I came because watching someone drink themselves to death isn't as satisfying as I thought it would be. Sebastian laughed, but there was no humor in it. Disappointed? I could try jumping off a bridge if that would be more entertaining. Stop it. The sharpness in her voice surprised them both. Your sister is dying. Don't insult her by making jokes about joining her. The words hit him like physical blows. His hands, wrapped around his glass, began to shake. You know about Emma? I know a lot of things, Meredith said carefully. I know. She's in room 314. I know Dr. Vance thinks she has maybe 2 months left. I know you've been there every single day for 3 months. Sebastian was quiet for so long that Meredith wondered if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. She forgave me, he said. Can you believe that? I killed her slowly, over years, with my greed and my willful blindness, and she forgave me. She said she was proud of what I was trying to do now, trying to fix things. He drained his glass and immediately signaled for another. But it doesn't matter, does it? All the money in the world can't undo what's already been done. All the cleanup efforts, all the donations, all the policy changes, none of it will save her. Meredith studied his profile in the mirror. This close, she could see the toll his guilt had taken. Dark circles under his eyes, stress lines around. His mouth, the telltale tremor of someone who hadn't been sleeping or eating properly? No, she agreed quietly. It won't save her, but it might save someone else's sister. Sebastian's laugh was bitter. Is that supposed to be comforting? Great Sebastian Thorne, learning basic human decency only after it's too late to matter. It's supposed to be honest. Meredith took a sip of her whiskey, feeling it burn down her throat. I spent 3 months hating you, fantasizing about your downfall, imagining you getting exactly what you deserved. She set down her glass and met his eyes in the mirror. But this? Watching you destroy yourself with guilt while your sister needs you to be strong? This isn't justice. This is just more waste. For the first time since she'd known him, Sebastian Thorne looked truly surprised. He turned to face her directly, studying her face as if trying to solve a complex equation. Why? He asked finally. Why do you care what happens to me? Meredith considered the question seriously. Why did she care? Now, this man had shattered her career, blacklisted her from her profession, forced her to rebuild her life from scratch. By all rights, she should be celebrating his suffering, because she said, slowly, working out the answer even as she spoke it, I lost my brother to corporate negligence 8 years ago. A chemical plant explosion that the company knew was coming but ignored because fixing it would have cost too much. I know what it feels like to carry that kind of anger, that need for someone to pay. Sebastian's eyes widened. This was information he clearly didn't have, despite whatever background check he'd undoubtedly run on her after firing her. But I also know, Meredith continued, that anger doesn't bring them back, doesn't undo the damage. It just eats you alive from the inside out until there's nothing left but bitterness. She finished her whiskey and stood up, pulling on her coat. Your sister forgave you because she loves you. Don't waste her gift by drinking yourself into oblivion. If you want to honor her memory, stay alive long enough to make the changes stick. She was almost to the door when his voice stopped her. Meredith, she turned back. Sebastian was still sitting at the bar, but his posture had changed somehow. Straighter, more present. I'm sorry for what I did to you, for what my company did to your brother, for all of it. The apology hung in the smoky air between them, heavy with months of unspoken pain. Meredith nodded once, acknowledging it without accepting or rejecting it. I know, she said simply. The question is, what are you going to do about it? The Bridgema Thorne died on a Tuesday morning in December, with her brother holding her hand and fresh flowers from Meredith's shop brightening her hospital room. She'd never known that the woman who brought her weekly bouquets was the same person Sebastian had wronged months earlier. Meredith had made sure of that. The funeral was a small private affair. Meredith watched from across the cemetery, standing beside Grace, who had come to pay respects to that sweet girl who loved. The white roses. Sebastian stood at the graveside like a statue, accepting condolences from the handful of attendees with mechanical politeness. But his eyes remained empty, fixed on something beyond the horizon. In the days that followed, he disappeared entirely. The newspapers reported that he'd taken an indefinite leave of absence from Thorne Industries, leaving the company in the hands of his executive board. Environmental cleanup efforts continued under their own momentum. But there were whispers that, without Sebastian's driving force, they might slow or stop altogether. Meredith told herself it wasn't her responsibility. She'd done her part by showing him a moment of human compassion in that bar. Whatever he chose to do with his grief was his decision to make. But when Tommy Rodriguez, a 10-year-old boy from the neighborhood near one of the contaminated sites, was rushed to Mercy General with symptoms eerily similar to Emma's early stages, Meredith found herself unable to stay detached. She was arranging flowers in Tommy's room when Dr. Vance pulled her aside. "We need to find Sebastian Thorne," the doctor said quietly. "This boy's case is directly related to the same contamination that killed his sister. We have 3 more children showing early symptoms, and the cleanup at that site stopped 2 weeks ago. If it doesn't resume immediately," she didn't need to finish. Meredith could see the trajectory clearly. More children would end up like Emma. And Sebastian was the only one with both the resources and the motivation to prevent it. The problem was finding him. His penthouse apartment was empty, his office abandoned, his usual haunts devoid of any sign of him. It was Grace who suggested checking the places that might call to someone drowning in grief. "When my husband died," the elderly woman said as they closed the shop that evening, I couldn't bear to be anywhere we'd been happy together. But I also couldn't stay away from the places where I could still feel him. Maybe look for him where he can still feel her presence." Which was how Meredith found herself at Riverside Elementary at 11 o'clock on a frigid December night. The school had been closed for 2 years due to contamination, its playground empty, its windows dark. But there was a figure sitting on the rusted swing set, barely visible in the dim glow of a distant STREETLIGHT. Sebastian looked like he'd been there for hours. His expensive coat was dusted with snow, his hair disheveled, his face gaunt from what had clearly been weeks of poor eating and no sleep. He was staring at the school building with an expression of such profound devastation that Meredith felt her own chest tighten in sympathy. "Emma went to school here," she said quietly as she approached, not wanting to startle him. He didn't seem surprised to see her. 3rd grade through 6th, he confirmed, his voice hoarse from disuse. She loved the monkey bars. Always scraped her knees because she insisted on trying tricks that were too advanced for her. Meredith settled onto the swing beside his, the metal chains creaking in the cold air. "Dr. Vance told me about Tommy Rodriguez." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "I know. I've been monitoring the hospital admissions. 3 more children showing symptoms. 2 more families about to lose everything that matters." The cleanup stopped. "Board thinks I've lost my mind," Sebastian said bitterly, "spending millions on environmental remediation with no guarantee of profit recovery. They're threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent if I don't return to business as usual." He stood up abruptly, pacing to the chain-link fence that separated the playground from the contaminated field beyond. "Do you know what Emma said to me the day before she died?" Meredith waited, sensing that this was important. "She said she was glad her death would mean something, that other children would be saved, because I finally understood what my choice is." His voice cracked. "How do I tell her I failed? How do I explain that I'm not strong enough to fight an entire board of directors who only see dollar signs?" The wind picked up, sending snow swirling around them like angry spirits. Meredith watched Sebastian's shoulders shake, whether from cold or emotion. She couldn't tell. "You don't tell her anything," Meredith said firmly, standing up and joining him at the fence. "You show her." Sebastian turned to look at her, and she was struck by how young he looked despite his 34 years. Stripped of his corporate armor and polished confidence, he seemed almost vulnerable. "How?" he asked simply. Meredith took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would change everything between them and possibly change her own life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. "You stopped trying to do this alone," she said. "You remember? That the person who exposed your company's crimes in the first place might actually be a valuable ally instead of an enemy." The suggestion hung in the frozen air between them. Sebastian stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. "You want to help me?" he asked incredulously. "After everything I did to you?" "I want to help those children," Meredith corrected. "I want to prevent other families from going through what you're going through, what I went through when I lost my brother. If working with you is how I do that, then yes, I want to help you." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, processing her offer. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, less broken, more purposeful. "My board will fight us every step of the way. They'll try to discredit you, destroy your reputation, make your life hell." Meredith almost smiled. "Can't destroy a reputation that's already been destroyed, and they can't threaten a career that no longer exists. That's the advantage of having nothing left to lose." For the first time since Emma's funeral, something that might have been hope flickered in Sebastian's eyes. "You realize this could take years? That we might lose more battles than we win?" "Med didn't have years," Meredith replied quietly. "Tommy Rodriguez might. And the children who haven't been exposed yet definitely do." Sebastian extended his hand to her then, not as a billionaire CEO making a deal, but as one broken person reaching out to another. "Partners?" he asked. Meredith looked at his outstretched hand, thinking about all the paths that had led them to. This moment, it's a contamination that had killed her brother and his sister, the moral stand that had cost her everything. It's the storm that had stripped away his defenses and shown her his humanity. She took his hand. "Partners." The healing 2 years later is the Emma Thorne Environmental Justice. Its foundation occupied an entire floor of a renovated warehouse in the city's arts district, far from the gleaming corporate towers where Sebastian had once ruled, infinitely more alive with purpose and hope. The space buzzed with controlled chaos, lawyers preparing class action suits against polluting corporations, scientists analyzing water and soil samples from contaminated communities, community organizers planning educational workshops, and a small army of volunteers coordinating everything from fundraising events to direct aid for affected families. At the center of it all, Meredith moved through the organized mayhem with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her true calling. Her title was officially executive director, but she was really the heart that kept the foundation beating. Person who remembered that behind every case file and legal brief was a human story worth fighting for. The Rodriguez family just got their settlement, announced Marcus Webb, their lead environmental lawyer, as he burst through the main conference room doors. $2.7 million, plus full medical coverage for Tommy's ongoing treatment. Cheers erupted from the dozen staff members gathered around the large table. But Meredith noticed Sebastian's reaction was more subdued. He smiled and nodded appropriately. But she'd learned to read the subtle signs of his emotional weather over the past 2 years. After the meeting dispersed, she found him on the building's roof garden, another of his quiet transformations, turning an unused space into something that could nurture life. He was tending to the tomato plants that would supply the foundations. Small cafe, his expensive suits long since replaced by practical work clothes. "You're thinking about Emma again?" Meredith observed, settling onto the bench they'd installed beside the herb garden. Sebastian's hands stilled on the tomato vines. "Is it that obvious? Only to someone who knows you. It's everyone else. You just looked appropriately pleased about the settlement." He sat back on his heels, brushing dirt from his hands. "I can't help wondering if she knows. About Tommy, about the 43 families we've helped, about the 6 sites we've cleaned up. Does she know that her death wasn't meaningless?" It was a conversation they'd had in various forms over the past 2 years, especially on significant anniversaries: Emma's birthday, the date of her diagnosis, the day she died. Sebastian's grief had evolved from the raw, a destructive force that had nearly consumed him, into something more complex. A driving purpose laced with persistent guilt and the kind of love that refuses to be buried. "I think she knows," Meredith said gently. "But more importantly, I think she'd be proud of who you've become." Sebastian looked up at her then, and she was struck by how much he'd changed. The harsh angles of his face had softened with purpose, and increasingly with something that looked like peace. His gray eyes, once cold as winter steel, now carried warmth and genuine concern for others. "Who I've become," he repeated thoughtfully. "Sometimes I barely recognize myself. The man who fired you for trying to do the right thing. It feels like remembering someone else's life." "People change," Meredith replied. "Usually gradually, but sometimes grief cracks us open so completely that we have to rebuild from scratch. You chose to rebuild better." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the late afternoon sun paint the city skyline in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere below, traffic hummed, and people hurried home to their families. It was ordinary and beautiful and precious, the kind of moment Sebastian had once been too busy to notice. "Meredith," he said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you." She turned to face him, noting the slight nervousness in his expression. In 2 years of working together, they'd faced down hostile corporate lawyers, aggressive board members, and the heart-wrenching stories of families destroyed by environmental negligence. She'd rarely seen him look uncertain about anything anymore. "The foundation is stable now," he continued. "Funded through the next decade, fully staffed, legally bulletproof. Don't need me anymore, not really. The work will continue with or without my involvement." A cold knot formed in Meredith's stomach. "Are you leaving? I'm asking if you want me to." The question hung between them, heavy with implications that went far beyond their professional partnership. Over the past year, their relationship had been shifting in subtle ways, hands that lingered a moment too long when passing documents, conversations that extended far past work hours. A growing intimacy born of shared purpose and mutual respect. "Why would I want you to leave?" she asked carefully. Sebastian stood up, pacing to the roof's edge where the setting sun cast his profile in sharp relief. "Because I hurt you. Because I destroyed your career and your trust in the system you dedicated your life to. Because working with me every day means you can never fully move past what I did." He turned back to face her. "You've given me forgiveness I don't deserve, and partnership I never earned. But forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, and partnership isn't the same as something more." The words settled between them like seeds waiting to sprout. Meredith felt her heart begin to race, not with anxiety but with a possibility she'd been afraid to acknowledge even to herself. "Sebastian," she said softly, standing to join him at the roof's edge. "Do you remember what you asked me that night in the bar? Why I cared what happened to you?" He nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "I told you it was because I understood loss, because I knew anger would consume you. That was true, but it wasn't complete." She took a deep breath, gathering courage. "I cared because somewhere under all that guilt and pain, I could see the man Emma believed you could become. The man I see standing in front of me right now." Sebastian's expression shifted, hope and vulnerability warring across his features. "And what man is that? Someone who turns his greatest mistake into his greatest purpose. Someone who honors the dead by protecting the living. Someone who proves that redemption isn't just possible, it's transformative." The sun dipped below. The horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Around them, the first stars were becoming visible, tiny lights pushing back against the gathering darkness. "I don't want you to leave," Meredith said simply. "Not the foundation, not this work, and not this, whatever this is between us." Sebastian stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "What if I told you I love you?" he asked quietly. "What if I told you that working beside you every day has been the greatest privilege of my life, and that the thought of continuing this work or any work without you makes me feel more lost than I did that night in the storm?" Meredith felt tears prick at her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of coming home to something she hadn't even realized she'd been searching for. "Then I'd tell you that love isn't about deserving each other," she whispered. "It's about choosing each other again and again, even when it's complicated. Especially when it's complicated." When Sebastian kissed her, it was with the reverence of someone who had learned not to take precious things for granted. It was a kiss that tasted of forgiveness and possibility, of two people who had found their way to each other through the wreckage of their separate griefs. Above them, the stars grew brighter, and below them, the city continued its ancient rhythm of loss and renewal, ending and beginning, destruction and the radical act of choosing to build something better from the ruins. In the distance, a church. Bell chimed 9 o'clock, the same time Emma's visiting hours used to end, the same time Sebastian used to leave the hospital and walk into the storm of his own making. But tonight, instead of walking into darkness, he was walking into light, hand in hand with the woman who had shown him that sometimes the people who wound us most deeply are also the ones who can teach us how to heal. And in the roof garden of the Emma Thorne Environmental Justice Foundation, surrounded by growing things and the promise of seasons yet to come. To people who had lost everything, learn that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones born from the ashes of who we used to be.